The former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, ironically joked that the reason why there were no coups in the US is because there are no American embassies. So to what extent is this true? It is no surprise to anyone that the United States has been responsible for several coups in multiple parts of the world, including Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Furthermore, it has sent its forces into Iraq, Panama, Syria, Afghanistan, and Libya. In some cases, overthrowing democratically elected regimes and establishing dictatorships would last several years, leaving thousands dead, missing, and in pain, especially during the Cold War era. The executive power's reach is wide, but it isn't omnipotent, and it will always be under the control of Congress. The President of the United States cannot dissolve Congress, as is the case in other Western countries. As the head of state or government and the armed forces, anyone who successfully takes this power by force will undoubtedly be one of the most powerful individuals in the world. It might seem very unlikely that a highly developed country could suffer a military uprising, but it wouldn't be unprecedented. In 1958, France experienced a military revolt in Algeria that could have potentially expanded to mainland France. Without this revolt, Charles de Gaulle would not have been president, and the current Fifth French Republic would have never existed. So why does it seem like the United States is impervious to a coup d'etat? What are the mechanisms to prevent this from happening? And could a coup ever be possible in the United States? So without further introduction, let's begin. The last military rebellion in the US dates back to more than 280 years ago. This was also a successful military rebellion, now known as the Revolutionary War, where the 13 British colonies rose against the rule of the British Empire and established itself as a sovereign state in 1776. The American Civil War was an attempt to cede from the rest of the United States, but it wasn't intended to overthrow the established government in Washington, D.C., so it can't really be considered as an attempted coup. First of all, it's necessary to understand that within the United States Constitution, the duty of the military is to protect and defend the US Constitution. So if the president were ever to abuse his or her functions or attempt anything unconstitutional, and if Congress were to be unable or unwilling to impeach the president, it is at this point that the US military could intervene and question the legitimacy of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Okay, so let's say that eventually the president exceeded his or her functions and Congress cannot or does not act. Would it then be time to take arms and invade the White House? Not quite yet. One of the main obstacles that stop a coup from happening is that the US is a federal republic. It is a vast country with a vast territory, and in order for it to work well, it has been subdivided into smaller entities and powers. So really, the first obstacle of a successful military coup is the fact that the military authority does not fall on any one person. Thus, the National Guard, unless called to federal service, is subject to the authority of state governors. Meanwhile, US gun control laws aren't as strict as other countries, which means that any possible coup leader would have to deal with the problem of the armed citizens. The United States barely has 5% of the world's population, but the 43% of weapons destined for citizens. So in order to neutralize these two fronts of potential resistance, the conspirators of a US military coup would have to deny them any information about what is happening. Due to the great territorial extension of the United States, ceding the capital city, entering the Capitol building by force, and isolating the White House would not be enough. Although DC is the political center of the country, this is not at all an economic or financial center. So the rebels must not only invade DC, but they must also do the same with New York City, LA, Chicago, Miami, and Houston, the financial, political, and communication epicenters of the country. However, these strengths that the US has to avoid such a coup also have weaknesses. They actually have two factors that could potentially aid a coup. The first is that the near impossibility of a coup means that US intelligence agencies, such as the FBI, are not necessarily monitoring if the military is disgruntled, nor are they looking for any signs of discomfort within the army. The second factor that could play in favor of a coup is that given the immensity and complexity of the US military, a conspiracy of several high-ranking military personnel distributed through a country could move troops and assets without warning until the effective coup. Obviously, this would not be effective for a long period of time because such a display of this significant number of troops must come from direct orders of the President of the United States, or the governor of the states in question. If more than 30,000 troops were to mobilize to DC through the country's highways without orders from DC, it would definitely create many suspicions, and the soldiers themselves would wonder what their actual deployment is for. So for any coup to be successful, it is essential that there is a general shutdown of all communications and possibly even energy so that the plan can be carried out without complications. One of the main reasons why the 2016 coup in Turkey failed was because Erdogan managed to upload a response from his cell phone. In a video message, he asked the citizens themselves to rise up and face the army. This failed coup left hundreds dead. In the current context, we can imagine that Trump would tweet about an occurring coup, so it'll be important to first take out his access to his smartphone. In order to blind the US communications, the cooperation of a strong network of hackers would be needed in order to disable electricity and satellite systems within the country. There have already been several reports indicating that the US has more than a few weaknesses in this aspect, but when it comes to planning to cut communications of the entire country, it would need an unprecedented level of technological, operational, and strategic coordination. Any successful plan would also have to secure the Army's own communications network, which would mean taking control of the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, through which the country's nuclear arsenal is controlled. This brings us to another key point: the nuclear arsenal of the United States, estimated at more than 5,000 nuclear weapons. The president constantly carries a nuclear briefcase, and with this briefcase, the president and only the president can authorize a nuclear attack. And in order to unlock this briefcase, the president must be identified through fingerprints and retina scanners. So hypothetically, if the rebels were to control the nuclear arsenal, obviously they would need to capture the president alive in order to have access. If the president were to refuse to give up the codes, nothing can be done, and they would not have access to launch them anywhere in the world. So if the president cooperates and gives up his codes, and the Pentagon had already been breached, then the coup leaders at the White House, with the president and the Pentagon alike, will have access to all the US nuclear weapons. If this hypothetical situation were to occur, the most powerful nuclear arsenal in the world would be under the control of a few rebellious individuals. However, while the president is alive or refuses to resign, the president would still remain the chief of the armed forces. If the president resigns or dies, the vice president will have to assume power. And if the vice resigns or dies, then the Speaker of the House of Representatives must assume power. So this raises another question: what would happen to the US Congress? With the absence of the president and vice president, it is the president of the lower chamber who by law must assume legitimate power. In this case, the Speaker of the House could call upon the military not aligned with the coup and the civilians themselves to restore the legitimate order in the country. Such a scenario is already imagined in the Hollywood film White House Down, where the Secretary of Defense, together with a group of soldiers, attempt to get rid of the president and vice and infiltrates the Speaker of the House within the coup plan in order to carry out a nuclear attack. So in short, the whole world would be glued to their screens watching as the coup takes place, uncertain of the future of the world, as the coup of the US would undoubtedly impact every corner of the globe. Neighboring countries such as Mexico and Canada would mobilize their army towards the border to shield themselves from possible attacks from the new military leadership. Russia and China would mobilize their fleets at an unprecedented scale in order to either contain possible attacks or conduct some themselves, especially from the Pacific and Alaskan front. The European Union would be stunned and possibly have no choice but to try to cooperate with the new military leadership established in the country. A successful coup of the US would plunge the country into a deep economic disaster. There would be widespread disorder and civil disobedience on the part of the millions of armed Americans who would not recognize the new regime. And in fact, the Second Amendment of the Constitution precisely establishes that an armed militia is necessary for the liberation and good functioning of the state, and therefore the right to bear arms will not be violated. So in a country with heavily armed civilians, it would not be long before conflicts in all parts of the country erupted, and if a civil war doesn't break out, the military in the White House would be forced to give up their power, seeing the economic cataclysm of the country, something that a military regime might not be equipped in solving. In reality, a coup of the US wouldn't end well for any side involved. The US population would prefer to vote at polls than to support a coup in case change is needed. And well, most of the world would probably feel the same. So to answer the question, why there hasn't been a coup in the US, can be summarized in a simple statement: there is no need, nor has there ever been a need for one. The institutions of the US are strong, stable, and highly coordinated, which would make the execution of coups virtually impossible. In the case of other countries around the world, regimes can be much less stable, and institutions can be much weaker than the states. Armies of developing countries are more susceptible to corruption, and an American-backed coup in other states is more improbable to deny. But in the case of the US, just because they themselves have never experienced a coup, it doesn't mean that they can't carry out coups in other nations. Take a look at the United Kingdom, for example. They have not changed their regime since the Revolution of 1688, and they have maintained a monarchical parliamentary system. And this is the case for most developed countries with sufficiently efficient democratic systems which never needed the military from having to intervene. In the case of most developing countries or underdeveloped countries, they are often the victims of global superpower pressure or the internal instability in their own countries, and they become susceptible to coups and the implementation of dictators. The possibility that the US will someday suffer a coup is so remote that we can say that it is highly improbable, but it is not entirely impossible. If a chain of events could lead to the fall of Germany, could have given way to Hitler's uprising that left 50 million dead, we cannot say without a shadow of a doubt that the US will never be a victim of a coup or a dictatorship. So what are your thoughts? Would you consider that a coup in the US would be feasible or simply impossible? Do you think that because they are a massive world power that they are immune from coups, but instead impose them on less developed countries? So I hope you enjoyed this week's video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this every single week. See you next time.